Chapter 35 of the White Company. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. The White Company by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 35. How Sir Nigel hawked at an eagle. To the south of Pamplona, in the kingdom of Navarre, there stretched a high table land, rising into bare sterile hills, brown or grey in colour, and strewn with huge boulders of granite. On the Gascon side of the great mountains there had been running streams, meadows, forests, and little nestling villages. Here, on the contrary, were nothing but naked rocks, poor pasture, and savage stone strewn wastes. Gloomy defiles or barrancas intersected this wild country, with mountain torrents dashing and foaming between their rugged sides. The clatter of waters, the scream of the eagle, and the howling of wolves, the only sounds which broke upon the silence in that dreary and inhospitable region. Through this wild country it was that Sir Nigel and his company pushed their way, riding at times through vast defiles, where the brown gnarled cliffs shot up on either side of them, and the sky was but a long winding blue slit between the clustering lines of box which fringed the lips of the precipices; or, again, leading their horses along the narrow and rocky paths worn by the muleteers upon the edges of the chasm, where under their very elbows they could see the white streak which marked the Gave which foamed 1,000 feet below them. So for 2 days they pushed their way through the wild places of Navarre, past Fuente, over the rapid Ega, through Estella, until upon a winter's evening the mountains fell away from in front of them, and they saw the broad blue Ebro curving betwixt its double line of homesteads and of villages. The fishers of Viana were aroused that night by rough voices speaking in a strange tongue, and ere morning Sir Nigel and his men had ferried the river and were safe upon the land of Spain. All the next day they lay in a pine wood near to the town of Logrono, resting their horses and taking counsel as to what they should do. Sir Nigel had with him Sir William Felton, Sir Oliver Buttesthorn, stout old Sir Simon Burley, the Scotch knight errant, the Earl of Angus, and Sir Richard Causton, all accounted amongst the bravest knights in the army, together with 60 veteran men at arms and 320 archers. Spies had been sent out in the morning, and returned after nightfall to say that the King of Spain was encamped some 14 miles off in the direction of Burgos, having with him 20,000 horse and 45,000 foot. A dry wood fire had been lit, and round this the leaders crouched, the glare beating upon their rugged faces, while the hardy archers lounged and chatted amid the tethered horses, while they munched their scanty provisions. "For my part," said Sir Simon Burley, "I am of opinion that we have already done that which we have come for. For do we not now know where the king is, and how great a following he hath, which was the end of our journey?" "True," answered Sir William Felton, "but I have come on this venture because it is a long time since I have broken a spear in war, and, certes, I shall not go back until I have run a course with some cavalier of Spain. Let those go back who will, but I must see more of these Spaniards ere I turn." "I will not leave you, Sir William," returned Sir Simon Burley; "and yet, as an old soldier and one who hath seen much of war, I cannot but think that it is an ill thing for 400 men to find themselves between an army of 60,000 on the one side and a broad river on the other." "Yet," said Sir Richard Causton, "we cannot for the honor of England go back without a blow struck." "Nor for the honor of Scotland either," cried the Earl of Angus. "By St. Andrew, I wish that I may never set eyes upon the water of Leith again if I pluck my horse's bridle ere I had seen this camp of theirs." "By St. Paul, you have spoken very well," said Sir Nigel, "and I have always heard that there were very worthy gentlemen among the Scots, and fine skirmishing to be had upon their border. Bethink you, Sir Simon, that we have this news from the lips of common spies, who can scarce tell us as much of the enemy and of his forces as the prince would wish to hear." "You are the leader of this venture, Sir Nigel," the other answered, "and I do but ride under your banner. Yet I would fain have your rede and counsel, Sir Simon. But touching what you say of the river, we can take heed that we shall not have it at the back of us, for the prince hath now advanced to Salvatierra and thence to Vittoria, so that if we come upon their camp from the further side we can make good our retreat." "What then would you propose?" asked Sir Simon, shaking his grizzled head as one who is but half convinced. "That we ride forward ere the news reach them that we have crossed the river. In this way we may have sight of their army, and perchance even find occasion for some small deed against them." "So be it then," said Sir Simon Burley; and the rest of the council having approved, a scanty meal was hurriedly snatched, and the advance resumed under the cover of darkness. All night they led their horses, stumbling and groping through wild defiles and rugged valleys, following the guidance of a frightened peasant who was strapped by the wrist to Black Simon's stirrup leather. With the early dawn they found themselves in a black ravine, with others sloping away from it on either side, and bare brown crags rising in long bleak terraces all round them. "If it please you, fair lord," said Black Simon, "this man hath misled us, and since there is no tree upon which we may hang him, it might be well to hurl him over yonder cliff." The peasant, reading the soldier's meaning in his fierce eyes and harsh accents, dropped upon his knees, screaming loudly for mercy. "How comes it, dog?" asked Sir William Felton in Spanish. "Where is this camp to which you swore that you would lead us?" "By the sweet Virgin, by the blessed Mother of God!" cried the trembling peasant, "I swear to you that in the darkness I have myself lost the path." "Over the cliff with him!" shouted half a dozen voices. But ere the archers could drag him from the rocks to which he clung, Sir Nigel had ridden up and called upon them to stop. "How is this, sirs?" said he. "As long as the prince doth give me the honor to entrust this venture to me, it is for me only to give orders, and by St. Paul! I shall be right blithe to go very deeply into the matter with any one to whom my words may give offence. How say you, Sir William? Or you, my Lord Angus? Or you, Sir Richard?" "Nay, nay, Nigel," cried Sir William. "This base peasant is too small a matter for old comrades to quarrel over. But he hath betrayed us, and certes he hath merited a dog's death." "Hark ye, fellow," said Sir Nigel, "we give you one more chance to find the path. We are about to gain much honor, Sir William, in this enterprise, and it would be a sorry thing if the first blood shed were that of an unworthy boor. Let us say our morning orisons, and it may chance that ere we finish he may strike upon the track." With bowed heads and steel caps in hand, the archers stood at their horses' heads, while Sir Simon Burley repeated the Pater, the Ave, and the Credo. Long did Alleyne bear the scene in mind: the knot of knights in their dull leaden hued armor, the ruddy visage of Sir Oliver, the craggy features of the Scottish earl, the shining scalp of Sir Nigel, with the dense ring of hard bearded faces, and the long brown heads of the horses, all topped and circled by the beetling cliffs. Scarce had the last deep Amen broken from the company, when in an instant there rose a scream of 100 bugles, and the deep rolling of drums and the clashing of cymbals, all sounding together in one deafening uproar. Knights and archers sprang to arms, convinced that some great host was upon them, but the guide dropped upon his knees and thanked Heaven for its mercies. "We have found them, caballeros!" he cried. "This is their morning call. If ye will but deign to follow me, I will set them before you ere a man might tell his beads." As he spoke he scrambled down one of the narrow ravines, and climbing over a low ridge at the further end, he led them into a short valley with a stream purling down the centre of it, and a very thick growth of elder and of box upon either side. Pushing their way through the dense brushwood, they looked out upon a scene which made their hearts beat harder and their breath come faster. In front of them there lay a broad plain, watered by two winding streams and covered with grass, stretching away to where, in the furthest distance, the towers of Burgos bristled up against the light blue morning sky. Over all this vast meadow there lay a great city of tents, thousands upon thousands of them, laid out in streets and in squares like a well ordered town. high silken pavilions or colored marquees shooting up from among the crowd of meaner dwellings, marked where the great lords and barons of Leon and Castile displayed their standards; while over the white roofs, as far as I could reach, the waving of ancients, pavons, pensils, and banderoles, with flash of gold and glow of colors, proclaimed that all the chivalry of Iberia were mustered in the plain beneath them. Far off in the centre of the camp a huge palace of red and white silk, with the royal arms of Castile waving from the summit, announced that the gallant Henry lay there in the midst of his warriors. As the English adventurers, peeping out from behind their brushwood screen, looked down upon this wondrous sight, they could see that the vast army in front of them was already afoot. The first pink light of the rising sun glittered upon the steel caps and breastplates of dense masses of slingers and of crossbowmen, who drilled and marched in the spaces which had been left for their exercise. 1,000 columns of smoke reeked up into the pure morning air, where the faggots were piled and the camp kettles already simmering. In the open plain clouds of light horse galloped and swooped, with swaying bodies and waving javelins, after the fashion which the Spanish had adopted from their Moorish enemies. All along by the sedgy banks of the rivers long lines of pages led their masters' chargers down to water, while the knights themselves lounged in gaily dressed groups about the doors of their pavilions, or rode out with their falcons upon their wrists and their greyhounds behind them in quest of quail or of leveret. "By my hilt, mon gar," whispered Aylward to Alleyne, as the young squire stood with parted lips and wondering eyes, gazing down at the novel scene before him, "we have been seeking them all night, but now that we have found them I know not what we are to do with them." "You say sooth, Samkin," quoth old Johnston. "I would that we were upon the far side of the Ebro again, for there is neither honor nor profit to be gained here. What say you, Simon?" "By the rood!" cried the fierce man at arms, "I will see the color of their blood ere I turn my mare's head for the mountains. Am I a child that I should ride for 3 days and nought but words at the end of it?" "Well said, my sweet honeysuckle!" cried Hordle John. "I am with you like hilt to blade. Could I but lay hands upon one of those gay prancers yonder, I doubt not that I should have ransom enough from him to buy my mother a new cow." "A cow!" said Aylward. "Say rather 10 acres and a homestead on the banks of the Avon." "Say you so? Then, by Our Lady, here is for yonder one in the red jerkin." He was about to push recklessly forward into the open, when Sir Nigel himself darted in front of him with his hand upon his breast. "Back!" said he. "Our time is not yet come, and we must lie here until evening. Throw off your jacks and headpieces, lest their eyes catch the shine, and tether the horses among the rocks." The order was swiftly obeyed, and in 10 minutes the archers were stretched along by the side of the brook, munching the bread and the bacon which they had brought in their bags, and craning their necks to watch the ever changing scene beneath them. Very quiet and still they lay, save for a muttered jest or whispered order, for twice during the long morning they heard bugle calls from amid the hills on either side of them, which showed that they had thrust themselves in between the outposts of the enemy. The leaders sat amongst the boxwood and took counsel together as to what they should do, while from below there surged up the buzz of voices, the shouting, the neighing of horses, and all the uproar of a great camp. "What boots it to wait?" said Sir William Felton. "Let us ride down upon their camp ere they discover us." "And so say I," cried the Scottish earl, "for they do not know that there is any enemy within 30 long leagues of them." "For my part," said Sir Simon Burley, "I think that it is madness, for you cannot hope to rout this great army, and where are you to go and what are you to do when they have turned upon you? How say you, Sir Oliver Buttesthorn?" "By the apple of Eve!" cried the fat knight, "it appears to me that this wind brings a very savory smell of garlic and of onions from their cooking kettles. I am in favor of riding down upon them at once, if my old friend and comrade here is of the same mind." "Nay," said Sir Nigel, "I have a plan by which we may attempt some small deed upon them, and yet, by the help of God, may be able to draw off again, which, as Sir Simon Burley hath said, would be scarce possible in any other way." "How then, Sir Nigel?" asked several voices. "We shall lie here all day, for amid this brushwood it is ill for them to see us. Then, when evening comes, we shall sally out upon them and see if we may not gain some honourable advancement from them." "But why then rather than now?" "Because we shall have nightfall to cover us when we draw off, so that we may make our way back through the mountains. I would station a score of archers here in the pass, with all our pennons jutting forth from the rocks, and as many nakers and drums and bugles as we have with us, so that those who follow us in the fading light may think that the whole army of the prince is upon them, and fear to go further. What think you of my plan, Sir Simon?" "By my troth, I think very well of it," cried the prudent old commander. "If 400 men must needs run a tilt against 60,000, I cannot see how they can do it better or more safely." "And so say I," cried Felton heartily. "But I wish the day were over, for it will be an ill thing for us if they chance to light upon us." The words were scarce out of his mouth when there came a clatter of loose stones, the sharp clink of trotting hoofs, and a dark faced cavalier mounted upon a white horse burst through the bushes and rode swiftly down the valley from the end which was farthest from the Spanish camp. Lightly armed, with his visor open and a hawk perched upon his left wrist, he looked about him with the careless air of a man who is bent wholly upon pleasure, and unconscious of the possibility of danger. Suddenly, however, his eyes lit upon the fierce faces which glared out at him from the brushwood. With a cry of terror he thrust his spurs into his horse's sides and dashed for the narrow opening of the gorge. For a moment it seemed as though he would have reached it, for he had trampled over or dashed aside the archers who threw themselves in his way. But Hordle John seized him by the foot in his grasp of iron and dragged him from the saddle, while two others caught the frightened horse. "Ho, ho!" roared the great archer. "How many cows wilt buy my mother if I set thee free?" "Hush that bull's bellowing!" cried Sir Nigel impatiently. "Bring the man here. By St. Paul! it is not the first time that we have met, for if I mistake not it is Don Diego Alvarez, who was once at the prince's court." "It is indeed I," said the Spanish knight, speaking in the French tongue, "and I pray you to pass your sword through my heart, for how can I live, I, a caballero of Castile, after being dragged from my horse by the base hands of a common archer?" "Fret not for that," answered Sir Nigel, "for in sooth, had he not pulled you down, a dozen cloth yard shafts had crossed each other in your body." "By St. James! it were better so than to be polluted by his touch," answered the Spaniard, with his black eyes sparkling with rage and hatred. "I trust that I am now the prisoner of some honourable knight or gentleman." "You are prisoner of the man who took you, Sir Diego," answered Sir Nigel, "and I may tell you that better men than either you or I have found themselves before now prisoners in the hands of archers of England." "What ransom then does he demand?" asked the Spaniard. Big John scratched his red head and grinned in high delight when the question was propounded to him. "Tell him," said he, "that I shall have 10 cows and a bull too, if it be but a little one. Also a dress of blue sendal for mother and a red one for Joan, with 5 acres of pasture land, 2 scythes, and a fine new grindstone, likewise a small house with stalls for the cows, and 36 gallons of beer for the thirsty weather." "Tut, tut!" cried Sir Nigel, laughing. "All these things may be had for money, and I think, Don Diego, that 5,000 crowns is not too much for so renowned a knight. It shall be duly paid him. For some days we must keep you with us, and I must crave leave also to use your shield, your armor, and your horse." "My harness is yours by the law of arms," said the Spaniard gloomily. "I do but ask the loan of it. I have need of it this day, but it shall be duly returned to you. Set guards, Aylward, with arrow on string at either end of the pass, for it may happen that some other cavaliers may visit us ere the time be come." All day the little band of Englishmen lay in the sheltered gorge, looking down upon the vast host of their unconscious enemies. Shortly after midday a great uproar of shouting and cheering broke out in the camp, with mustering of men and calling of bugles. Clambering up upon the rocks, the companions saw a long rolling cloud of dust along the whole eastern sky line, with the glint of spears and the flutter of pennons. which announced the approach of a large body of cavalry. For a moment a wild hope came upon them that perhaps the prince had moved more swiftly than had been planned, and that he had crossed the Ebro, and that this was his vanguard sweeping to the attack. "Surely I see the red pile of Chandos at the head of yonder squadron," cried Sir Richard Causton, shading his eyes with his hand. "Not so," answered Sir Simon Burley, who had watched the approaching host with a darkening face. "It is even as I feared. That is the double eagle of Du Guesclin." "You say very truly," cried the Earl of Angus. "These are the levies of France, for I can see the ensigns of the Marshal d'Andreghen, and that of the Lord d'Antoine, and of Briseuil, and of many another from Brittany and Anjou." "By St. Paul! I am very glad of it," said Sir Nigel. "Of these Spaniards I know nothing, but the French are very worthy gentlemen, and will do what they can for our advancement." "There are at least 4,000 of them, all men at arms," cried Sir William Felton. "See, there is Bertrand himself beside his banner, and there is King Henry, who rides to welcome him. Now they all turn and come into camp together." As he spoke, the vast throng of Spaniards and of Frenchmen trooped across the plain, with brandished arms and tossing banners. All day long the sound of revelry and of rejoicing from the crowded camp swelled up to the ears of the Englishmen, and they could see the soldiers of the two nations throwing themselves into each other's arms and dancing hand in hand round the blazing fires. The sun had sunk behind a cloud bank in the west before Sir Nigel at last gave word that the men should resume their arms and have their horses ready. He had himself thrown off his armor, and had dressed himself from head to foot in the harness of the captured Spaniard. "Sir William," said he, "it is my intention to attempt a small deed, and I ask you therefore that you will lead this outfall upon the camp. For me, I will ride into their camp with my squire and 2 archers. I pray you to watch me, and to ride forth when I am come among the tents. You will leave 20 men behind here, as we planned this morning, and you will ride back here after you have ventured as far as seems good to you." "I will do as you order, Nigel. But what is it that you propose to do?" "You will see anon, and indeed it is but a trifling matter. Alleyne, you will come with me and lead a spare horse by the bridle. I will have the 2 archers who rode with us through France, for they are trusty men and of stout heart. Let them ride behind us, and let them leave their bows here among the bushes, for it is not my wish that they should know that we are Englishmen. Say no word to any whom we may meet, and if any speak to you, pass on as though you heard them not. Are you ready?" "I am ready, my fair lord," said Alleyne. "And I." "And I," cried Aylward and John. "Then the rest I leave to your wisdom, Sir William, and if God sends us fortune we shall meet you again in this gorge ere it be dark." So saying, Sir Nigel mounted the white horse of the Spanish cavalier, and rode quietly forth from his concealment with his 3 companions behind him, Alleyne leading his master's own steed by the bridle. So many small parties of French and Spanish horse were sweeping hither and thither that the small band attracted little notice, and making its way at a gentle trot across the plain, they came as far as the camp without challenge or hindrance. On and on they pushed past the endless lines of tents, amid the dense swarms of horsemen and of footmen, until the huge royal pavilion stretched in front of them. They were close upon it when of a sudden there broke out a wild hubbub from a distant portion of the camp, with screams and war cries and all the wild tumult of battle. At the sound soldiers came rushing from their tents, knights shouted loudly for their squires, and there was a mad turmoil on every hand of bewildered men and plunging horses. At the royal tent a crowd of gorgeously dressed servants ran hither and thither in helpless panic, for the guard of soldiers who were stationed there had already ridden off in the direction of the alarm. A man at arms on either side of the doorway were the sole protectors of the royal dwelling. "I have come for the king," whispered Sir Nigel, "and by St. Paul he must back with us, or I must bide here." Alleyne and Aylward sprang from their horses and flew at the 2 sentries, who were disarmed and beaten down in an instant by so furious and unexpected an attack. Sir Nigel dashed into the royal tent, and was followed by Hordle John as soon as the horses had been secured. From within came wild screamings and the clash of steel, and then the two emerged once more, their swords and forearms reddened with blood, while John bore over his shoulder the senseless body of a man whose gay surcoat, adorned with the lions and towers of Castile, proclaimed him to belong to the royal house. A crowd of white faced sewers and pages swarmed at their heels, those behind pushing forwards, while the foremost shrank back from the fierce faces and reeking weapons of the adventurers. The senseless body was thrown across the spare horse, the four sprang to their saddles, and away they thundered with loose reins and busy spurs through the swarming camp. But confusion and disorder still reigned among the Spaniards, for Sir William Felton and his men had swept through half their camp, leaving a long litter of the dead and the dying to mark their course. Uncertain who were their attackers, and unable to tell their English enemies from their newly arrived Breton allies, the Spanish knights rode wildly hither and thither in aimless fury. The mad turmoil, the mixture of races, and the fading light were all in favor of the four who alone knew their own purpose among the vast uncertain multitude. Twice ere they reached open ground they had to break their way through small bodies of horses, and once there came a whistle of arrows and singing of stones about their ears, but still dashing onwards they shot out from among the tents, and found their own comrades retreating for the mountains at no very great distance from them. Another 5 minutes of wild galloping over the plain, and they were all back in their gorge, while their pursuers fell back before the rolling of drums and blare of trumpets, which seemed to proclaim that the whole army of the prince was about to emerge from the mountain passes. "By my soul, Nigel," cried Sir Oliver, waving a great boiled ham over his head, "I have come by something which I may eat with my truffles. I had a hard fight for it, for there were 3 of them with their mouths open and the knives in their hands, all sitting agape round the table when I rushed in upon them. How say you, Sir William? Will you not try the smack of the famed Spanish swine, though we have but the brook water to wash it down?" "Later, Sir Oliver," answered the old soldier, wiping his grimed face. "We must further into the mountains ere we be in safety. But what have we here, Nigel?" "It is a prisoner whom I have taken, and in sooth, as he came from the royal tent and wears the royal arms upon his jupon, I trust that he is the King of Spain." "The King of Spain!" cried the companions, crowding round in amazement. "Nay, Sir Nigel," said Felton, peering at the prisoner through the uncertain light. "I have twice seen Henry of Trastamare, and certes this man in no way resembles him." "Then by the light of heaven I will ride back for him," cried Sir Nigel. Nay, the camp is in arms, and it would be rank madness. Who are you, fellow?" he added in Spanish, "and how is it that you dare to wear the arms of Castile?" The prisoner was bent, recovering the consciousness that had been squeezed from him by the grip of Hordle John. "If it please you," he answered, "I and 9 others are the body squires of the king, and must ever wear his arms so as to shield him from even such perils as have threatened him this night. The king is at the tent of the brave de Guesclin, where he will sup to night. But I am a caballero of Aragon, Don Sancho Penelosa, and though I may be no king, I am yet ready to pay a fitting price for my ransom." "By St. Paul! I will not touch your gold," cried Sir Nigel. "Go back to your master and give him greeting from Sir Nigel Loring of Twynham Castle, telling him that I had hoped to make his better acquaintance this night, and that if I have disordered his tent it was but in my eagerness to know so famed and courteous a knight. Spur on, comrades, for we must cover many a league ere we can venture to light fire or to loosen girth. I had hoped to ride without this patch to night, but it seems that I must carry it yet a little longer." Chapter 35. Chapter 36 of the White Company. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. The White Company by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 36. How Sir Nigel took the patch from his eye. It was a cold, bleak morning in the beginning of March, and the mist was drifting in dense rolling clouds through the passes of the Cantabrian mountains. The company, who had passed the night in a sheltered gully, were already astir, some crowding round the blazing fires, and others romping or leaping over each other's backs, for their limbs were chilled and the air biting. Here and there, through the dense haze which surrounded them, there loomed out huge pinnacles and jutting boulders of rock, while high above the sea of vapour there towered up one gigantic peak, with a pink glow of the early sunshine upon its snow capped head. The ground was wet, the rocks dripping, the grass and evergreens sparkling with beads of moisture, yet the camp was loud with laughter and merriment, for a messenger had ridden in from the prince with words of heart stirring praise for what they had done, and with orders that they should still abide in the forefront of the army. Round one of the fires were clustered 4 or 5 of the leading men of the archers, cleaning the rust from their weapons, and glancing impatiently from time to time at a great pot which smoked over the blaze. There was Aylward squatting cross legged in his shirt, while he scrubbed away at his chain mail brigandine, whistling loudly the while. On one side of him sat old Johnston, who was busy in trimming the feathers of some arrows to his liking, and on the other Hordle John, who lay with his great limbs asprawl and his headpiece balanced upon his uplifted foot. Black Simon of Norwich crouched amid the rocks, crooning an Eastland ballad to himself, while he whetted his sword upon a flat stone which lay across his knees, while beside him sat Alleyn Edricson and Norbury, the silent squire of Sir Oliver, holding out their chilled hands towards the crackling faggots. "Cast on another culpon, John, and stir the broth with thy sword sheath," growled Johnston, looking anxiously for the 20th time at the reeking pot. "For my hilt," cried Aylward, "now that John hath come by his great ransom, he will scarce abide the fare of poor archer lads. How say you, camarade? When you see Hordle once more, there will be no penny ale and fat bacon, but Gascon wines and baked meats every day of the 7." "I know not about that," said John, kicking his helmet up into the air and catching it in his hand. "I do but know that whether the broth be ready or no, I am about to dip this into it." "It simmers and it boils," cried Johnston, pushing his hard lined face through the smoke. In an instant the pot had been plucked from the blaze, and its contents had been scooped up in half a dozen steel headpieces, which were balanced betwixt their owners' knees, while with spoon and gobbet of bread they devoured their morning meal. "It is ill weather for bows," remarked John at last, when with a long sigh he drained the last drop from his helmet. "My strings are as limp as a cow's tail this morning." "You should rub them with water glue," quoth Johnston. "You remember, Samkin, that it was wetter than this on the morning of Cressy, yet I cannot call to mind that there was aught amiss with our strings." "It is in my thoughts," said Black Simon, still pensively grinding his sword, "that we may have need of your strings ere sundown. I dreamed of the red cow last night." "And what is this red cow, Simon?" asked Alleyne. "I know not, young sir, but I can only say that on the eve of Cadsand, and on the eve of Cressy, and on the eve of Nogent, I dreamed of a red cow, and now the dream has come upon me again, so I am now setting a very keen edge to my blade." "Well said, old Bordeaux!" cried Aylward. "By my hilt, I pray that your dream may come true, for the prince hath not sent us out here to drink broth and to gather whortleberries. One more fight and I am ready to hang up my bow, marry a wife, and take to the fire corner. How now, Robin? Whom is it that you seek?" "The Lord Loring craves your attendance in his tent," said a young archer to Alleyne. The squire rose and proceeded to the pavilion, where he found the knight seated upon a cushion with his legs crossed in front of him, and a broad ribbon of parchment laid across his knees, over which he was poring with frowning brows and pursed lips. "It came this morning by the prince's messenger," said he, "and was brought from England by Sir John Fallislee, who is new come from Sussex. What make you of this upon the outer side?" "It is fairly and clearly written," Alleyne answered, "and it signifies, 'To Sir Nigel Loring, Knight Constable of Twynham Castle, by the hand of Christopher, the servant of God at the Priory of Christchurch.'" "So I read it," said Sir Nigel. "Now I pray you to read what is set forth within." Alleyne turned to the letter, and as his eyes rested upon it his face turned pale, and a cry of surprise and grief burst from his lips. "What then?" asked the knight, peering up at him anxiously. "There is nought amiss with the Lady Mary or with the Lady Maude?" "It is my brother, my poor unhappy brother," cried Alleyne, with his hand to his brow. "He is dead." "By St. Paul! I have never heard that he had shown so much love for you that you should mourn him so." "Yet he was my brother, the only kith or kin that I had upon earth. Mayhap he had cause to be bitter against me, for his land was given to the Abbey for my upbringing. Alas! alas! And I raised my staff against him when last we met. He has been slain, and slain, I fear, amidst crime and violence." "Ha!" said Sir Nigel. "Read on, I pray you." "God be with thee, my honored lord, and have thee in his holy keeping. The Lady Loring hath asked me to set down in writing what hath befallen at Twynham, and all that concerns the death of thy ill neighbor, the Socman of Minstead. For when ye had left us this evil man gathered around him all outlaws, villains, and masterless men, until they were come to such a force that they slew and scattered the king's men who went against them. Then, coming forth from the woods, they laid siege to thy castle, and for 2 days they girt us in and shot hard against us, with such numbers as were a marvel to see. Yet the Lady Loring held the place stoutly, and on the second day the Socman was slain by his own men, as some think, so that we were delivered from their hands, for which praise be to all the saints, and more especially to the holy Anselm, upon whose feast it came to pass. The Lady Loring and the Lady Maude, thy fair daughter, are in good health, and so am I, save for an impostume of the toe joint, which hath been sent me for my sins. May all the saints preserve thee." "It was the vision of the Lady Tiphaine," said Sir Nigel, after a pause. "Marked you not how she said that the leader was one with a yellow beard, and how he fell before the gate? But how came it, Alleyne, that this woman, to whom all things are as crystal, and who hath not said one word which has not come to pass, was yet so led astray as to say that your thoughts turned to Twynham Castle even more than mine own?" "My fair lord," said Alleyne, with a flush on his weather stained cheeks, "the Lady Tiphaine may have spoken sooth when she said it, for Twynham Castle is in my heart by day and in my dreams by night." "Ha!" cried Sir Nigel, with a sidelong glance. "Yes, my fair lord, for indeed I love your daughter, the Lady Maude, and unworthy as I am, I would give my heart's blood to serve her." "By St. Paul, Edricson," said the knight coldly, arching his eyebrows, "you aim high in this matter. Our blood is very old." "And mine also is very old," answered the squire. "And the Lady Maude is our single child. All our name and land centre upon her." "Alas that I should say it, but I also am now the only Edricson." "And why have I not heard this from you before, Alleyne? In sooth I think that you have used me ill." "Nay, my fair lord, say not so, for I know not whether your daughter loves me, and there is no pledge between us." Sir Nigel pondered for a few moments, and then burst out a laughing. "By St. Paul!" said he, "I know not why I should mix in the matter, for I have ever found that the Lady Maude was very well able to look to her own affairs. Since first she could stamp her little foot she hath ever been able to get that for which she craved, and if she set her heart on thee, Alleyne, and thou on her, I do not think that this Spanish king with his 70,000 men could hold you apart. Yet this I will say, that I would see you a full knight ere you go to my daughter with words of love. I have ever said that a brave lance should wed her, and by my soul, Edricson, if God spare you, I think that you will acquit yourself well." But enough of such trifles, for we have our work before us, and it will be time to speak of this matter when we see the white cliffs of England once more. Go to Sir William Felton, I pray you, and ask him to come hither, for it is time that we were marching. There is no pass at the further end of the valley, and it is a perilous place should an enemy come upon us." Alleyne delivered his message, and then wandered forth from the camp, for his mind was all in a whirl with this unexpected news, and with his talk with Sir Nigel. Sitting upon a rock, with his burning brow resting upon his hands, he thought of his brother, of their quarrel, of the Lady Maude in her bedraggled riding dress, of the gray old castle, of the proud pale face in the armory, and of the last fiery words with which she had sped him on his way. Then he was but a penniless, monk bred lad, unknown and unfriended. Now he was himself Socman of Minstead, the head of an old stock, and the lord of an estate which, if reduced from its former size, was still ample to preserve the dignity of his family. Further, he had become a man of experience, and was counted brave among brave men, and had won the esteem and confidence of her father, and, above all, had been listened to by him when he told him the secret of his love. As to the gaining of knighthood, in such stirring times it was no great matter for a brave squire of gentle birth to aspire to that honor. He would leave his bones among these Spanish ravines, or he would do some deed which would call the eyes of men upon him. Alleyne was still seated on the rock, his griefs and his joys drifting swiftly over his mind like the shadow of clouds upon a sunlit meadow, when of a sudden he became conscious of a low, deep sound which came booming up to him through the fog. Close behind him he could hear the murmur of the bowmen, the occasional burst of hoarse laughter, and the champing and stamping of their horses. Behind it all, however, came that low pitched, deep toned hum which seemed to come from every quarter and to fill the whole air. In the old monastic days he remembered to have heard such a sound when he had walked out one windy night at Buckler's Hard, and had listened to the long waves breaking upon the shingly shore. Here, however, was neither wind nor sea, and yet the dull murmur rose ever louder and stronger out of the heart of the rolling sea of vapor. He turned and ran to the camp, shouting an alarm at the top of his voice. It was but 100 paces, and yet ere he had crossed it every bowman was ready at his horse's head, and the group of knights were out and listening intently to the ominous sound. "It is a great body of horse," said Sir William Felton, "and they are riding very swiftly hitherwards." "Yet they must be from the prince's army," remarked Sir Richard Causton, "for they come from the north." "Nay," said the Earl of Angus, "it is not so certain; for the peasant with whom we spoke last night said that it was rumored that Don Tello, the Spanish king's brother, had ridden with 6,000 chosen men to beat up the prince's camp. It may be that on their backward road they have come this way." "By St. Paul!" cried Sir Nigel, "I think that it is even as you say, for that same peasant had a sour face and a shifting eye, as one who bore us little good will. I doubt not that he has brought these cavaliers upon us." "But the mist covers us," said Sir Simon Burley. "We have yet time to ride through the further end of the pass." "Were we a troop of mountain goats we might do so," answered Sir William Felton, "but it is not to be passed by a company of horsemen. If these be indeed Don Tello and his men, then we must bide where we are, and do what we can to make them rue the day that they found us in their path." "Well spoken, William!" cried Sir Nigel in high delight. "If there be so many as has been said, then there will be much honor to be gained from them, and every hope of advancement. But the sound has ceased, and I fear that they have gone some other way. Or mayhap they have come to the mouth of the gorge and are marshalling their ranks. Hush and hearken, for they are no great way from us." The company stood peering into the dense fog wreath, amidst a silence so profound that the dripping of the water from the rocks and the breathing of the horses grew loud upon the ear. Suddenly from out of the sea of mist came the shrill sound of a neigh, followed by a long blast upon a bugle. "It is a Spanish call, my fair lord," said Black Simon. "It is used by their prickers and huntsmen when the beast hath not fled, but is still in its lair." "By my faith," said Sir Nigel, smiling, "if they are in a humour for venery we may promise them some sport ere they sound the mort over us. But there is a hill in the centre of the gorge on which we might take our stand." "I marked it yesternight," said Felton, "and no better spot could be found for our purpose, for it is very steep at the back. It is but a bow shot to the left, and indeed I can see the shadow of it." The whole company, leading their horses, passed across to the small hill which loomed in front of them out of the mist. It was indeed admirably designed for defence, for it sloped down in front, all jagged and boulder strewn, while it fell away in a sheer cliff of 100 feet or more. On the summit was a small uneven plateau, with a stretch across of 100 paces, and a depth of half as much again. "Unloose the horses," said Sir Nigel. "We have no space for them, and if we hold our own we shall have horses and to spare when this day's work is done. Nay, keep yours, my fair sirs, for we may have work for them. Aylward, Johnston, let your men form a harrow on either side of the ridge. Sir Oliver, and you, my Lord Angus, I give you the right wing, and the left to you, Sir Simon, and to you, Sir Richard Causton. I and Sir William Felton will hold the centre with our men at arms. Now order the ranks and fling wide the banners, for our souls are God's and our bodies the king's, and our swords for St. George and for England." Sir Nigel had scarcely spoken when the mist seemed to thin in the valley and to shred away into long ragged clouds which trailed from the edges of the cliffs. The gorge in which they had camped was a mere wedge shaped cleft among the hills, 3/4 of a mile deep, with the small rugged rising upon which they stood at the further end, and the brown crags walling it on 3 sides. As the mist parted and the sun broke through, it gleamed and shimmered with dazzling brightness upon the armor and headpieces of a vast body of horsemen, who stretched across the barranca from one cliff to the other, and extended backwards until the rear guard were far out upon the plain beyond. Line after line and rank after rank they choked the neck of the valley with a long vista of tossing pennons, twinkling lances, waving plumes and streaming banderoles, while the curvets and gambades of the chargers lent a constant motion and shimmer to the glittering many colored mass. A yell of exultation and a forest of waving steel through the length and breadth of their column announced that they could at last see their entrapped enemies, while the swelling notes of 100 bugles and drums, mixed with a clash of Moorish cymbals, broke forth into a proud peal of martial triumph. Strange it was to these gallant and sparkling cavaliers of Spain to look upon this handful of men upon the hill, the thin lines of bowmen, the knots of knights and men at arms with armor rusted and discolored from long service, and to learn that these were indeed the soldiers whose fame and prowess had been the camp fire talk of every army in Christendom. Very still and silent they stood, leaning upon their bows, while their leaders took counsel together in front of them. No clang of bugle rose from their stern ranks, but in the centre waved the leopards of England, on the right the ensign of their company with the roses of Loring, and on the left, over 80 of Welsh bowmen, there floated the red banner of Merlin with the boars' heads of the Buttesthorns. Gravely and sedately they stood beneath the morning sun, waiting for the onslaught of their foemen. "By St. Paul!" said Sir Nigel, gazing with puckered eye down the valley, "there appear to be some very worthy people among them. What is this golden banner which waves upon the left?" "It is the ensign of the Knights of Calatrava," answered Felton. "And the other upon the right? It marks the Knights of Santiago, and I see by his flag that their grand master rides at their head. There too is the banner of Castile amid yonder sparkling squadron which heads the main battle. There are 6000 men at arms, with 10 squadrons of slingers, as far as I may judge their numbers." "There are Frenchmen among them, my fair lord," remarked Black Simon. "I can see the pennons of De Couvette, de Brieux, Saint Paul, and many others who struck in against us for Charles of Blois." "You are right," said Sir William, "for I can also see them. There is much Spanish blazonry also, if I could but read it. Don Diego, you know the arms of your own land. Who are they who have done us this honor?" The Spanish prisoner looked with exultant eyes upon the deep and serried ranks of his countrymen. "By St. James!" said he, If ye fall this day ye fall by no mean hands, for the flower of the knighthood of Castile ride under the banner of Don Tello, with the chivalry of Asturias, Toledo, Leon, Cordova, Galicia, and Seville. I see the Guidons of Albornoz, Cocorola, Rodriguez, Tavora, with the two great orders, and the knights of France and of Aragon. If you will take my rede you will come to a composition with them, for they will give you such terms as you have given me." "Nay, by St. Paul! it were pity if so many brave men were drawn together and no little deed of arms to come of it. Ha, William, they advance upon us, and by my soul it is a sight that is worth coming over the seas to see." As he spoke, the two wings of the Spanish host, consisting of the knights of Calatrava on the one side and of Santiago upon the other, came swooping swiftly down the valley, while the main body followed more slowly behind. 500 paces from the English the two great bodies of horse crossed each other, and sweeping round in a curve, retired in feigned confusion towards their centre. Often in bygone wars had the Moors tempted the hot blooded Spaniards from their places of strength by such pretended flights, but these were men upon the hill to whom every ruse and trick of war were as their daily trade and practice. Again and even nearer came the rallying Spaniards, and again with cry of fear and stooping bodies they swerved off to right and left, but the English still stood solid and observant among their rocks. The vanguard halted a long bow shot from the hill, and with waving spears and vaunting shouts challenged their enemies to come forth, while two cavaliers, pricking forward from the glittering ranks, walked their horses slowly between the two arrays, with targets braced and lances in rest, like the challengers in a tourney. "By St. Paul!" cried Sir Nigel, with his one eye glowing like an ember, "these appear to be two very worthy and debonair gentlemen. I do not call to mind when I have seen any people who seemed of so great a heart and so high of enterprise. We have our horses, Sir William. Shall we not relieve them of any vow which they may have upon their souls?" Felton's reply was to bound upon his charger and to urge it down the slope, while Sir Nigel followed not 3 spears' lengths behind him. It was a rugged course, rocky and uneven, yet the two knights, choosing their men, dashed onwards at the top of their speed, while the gallant Spaniards flew as swiftly to meet them. The one to whom Felton found himself opposed was a tall stripling with a stag's head upon his shield, while Sir Nigel's man was broad and squat, with plain steel harness and a pink and white torse bound round his helmet. The first struck Felton on the target with such force as to split it from side to side, but Sir William's lance crashed through the camail which shielded the Spaniard's throat, and he fell screaming hoarsely to the ground. Carried away by the heat and madness of fight, the English knight never drew rein, but charged straight on into the array of the knights of Calatrava. Long time the silent ranks upon the hill could see a swirl and eddy deep down in the heart of the Spanish column, with a circle of rearing chargers and flashing blades. Here and there tossed the white plume of the English helmet, rising and falling like the foam upon a wave, with the fierce gleam and sparkle ever circling round it, until at last it had sunk from view, and another brave man had turned from war to peace. Sir Nigel, meanwhile, had found a foeman worthy of his steel, for his opponent was none other than Sebastian Gomez, the picked lance of the monkish knights of Santiago, who had won fame in 100 bloody combats with the Moors of Andalusia. So fierce was their meeting that their spears shivered up to the very grasp, and the horses reared backwards until it seemed that they must crash down upon their riders. Yet with consummate horsemanship they both swung round in a long curvet, and then plucking out their swords they lashed at each other like two lusty smiths hammering upon an anvil. The chargers spun round each other, biting and striking, while the two blades wheeled and whizzed and circled in gleams of dazzling light. Cut, parry, and thrust followed so swiftly upon each other that the eye could not follow them, until at last, coming thigh to thigh, they cast their arms around each other and rolled off their saddles to the ground. The heavier Spaniard threw himself upon his enemy, and pinning him down beneath him, raised his sword to slay him, while a shout of triumph rose from the ranks of his countrymen. But the fatal blow never fell, for even as his arm quivered before descending, the Spaniard gave a shudder, and stiffening himself, rolled heavily upon his side, with the blood gushing from his armpit and from the slit of his visor. Sir Nigel sprang to his feet with his bloody dagger in his left hand, and gazed down upon his adversary. But that fatal and sudden stab in the vital spot, which the Spaniard had exposed by raising his arm, had proved instantly mortal. The Englishman leapt upon his horse and made for the hill at the very instant that a yell of rage from 1,000 voices and the clang of a score of bugles announced the Spanish onset. But the islanders were ready and eager for the encounter. With feet firmly planted, their sleeves rolled back to give free play to their muscles, their long yellow bowstaves in their left hands, and their quivers slung to the front, they had waited in the 4 deep harrow formation, which gave strength to their array and yet permitted every man to draw his arrow freely without harm to those in front. Aylward and Johnston had been engaged in throwing light tufts of grass into the air to gauge the wind force, and a hoarse whisper passed down the ranks from the file leaders to the men, with scraps of advice and admonition. "Do not shoot outside the 15 score paces," cried Johnston. "We may need all our shafts ere we have done with them." "Better to overshoot than to undershoot," added Aylward. "Better to strike the rear guard than to feather a shaft in the earth." "Loose quick and sharp when they come," added another, "and let it be the eye to the string, and the string to the shaft, and the shaft to the mark. By Our Lady, their banners advance, and we must hold our ground now if ever we are to see Southampton Water again." Alleyne, standing with his sword drawn amidst the archers, saw a long toss and heave of the glittering squadrons. Then the front ranks began to surge slowly forward, to trot, to canter, and to gallop, and in an instant the whole vast array was hurtling onward, line after line, the air full of the thunder of their cries, the ground shaking with the beat of their hoofs, the valley choked with the rushing torrent of steel, topped by the waving plumes, the slanting spears, and the fluttering banderoles. On they swept, over the level and up to the slope, ere they met the blinding storm of the English arrows. Down went the whole ranks in a whirl of mad confusion, horses plunging and kicking, bewildered men falling, rising, staggering, or on back, while ever new lines of horsemen came spurring through the gaps and urged their chargers up the fatal slope. All around him Alleyne could hear the stern, short orders of the master bowman, while the air was filled with the keen twanging of the strings and the swish and patter of the shafts. Right across the foot of the hill there had sprung up a long wall of struggling horse and stricken men, which ever grew and heightened as fresh squadrons poured on the attack. One young knight on a gray jennet leapt over his fallen comrades and galloped swiftly up the hill, shrieking loudly upon St. James ere he fell within a spear length of the English line, with the feathers of arrows thrusting out from every crevice and joint of his armor. So for 5 long minutes the gallant horsemen of Spain and of France strove ever and again to force a passage, until the wailing note of a bugle called them back, and they rode slowly out of bowshot, leaving their best and their bravest in the ghastly blood mottled heap behind them. But there was little rest for the victors. Whilst the knights had charged them in front, the slingers had crept round upon either flank, and had gained a footing upon the cliffs and behind the outlying rocks. A storm of stones broke suddenly upon the defenders, who, drawn up in lines upon the exposed summit, offered a fair mark for their hidden foes. Johnston, the old archer, was struck upon the temple and fell dead without a groan, while 15 of his bowmen and 6 of the men at arms were struck down at the same moment. The others lay on their faces to avoid the deadly hail, while at each side of the plateau a fringe of bowmen exchanged shots with the slingers and crossbowmen among the rocks, aiming mainly at those who had swarmed up the cliffs, and bursting into laughter and cheers when a well aimed shaft brought one of their opponents toppling down from his lofty perch. "I think, Nigel," said Sir Oliver, striding across to the little knight, "that we should all acquit ourselves better had we our noon meat, for the sun is high in the heaven." "By St. Paul!" quoth Sir Nigel, plucking the patch from his eye, "I think that I am now clear of my vow, for this Spanish knight was a person from whom much honor might be won. Indeed, he was a very worthy gentleman, of good courage and great hardiness, and it grieves me that he should have come by such a hurt. As to what you say of food, Oliver, it is not to be thought of, for we have nothing with us upon the hill." "Nigel," cried Sir Simon Burley, hurrying up with consternation upon his face, Aylward tells me that there are not 10 score arrows left in all their sheaves. See, they are springing from their horses and cutting their sollerets, so that they may rush upon us. Might we not even now make a retreat?" "My soul will retreat from my body first," cried the little knight. "Here I am and here I bide, while God gives me strength to lift a sword." "And so say I," shouted Sir Oliver, throwing his mace high into the air and catching it again by the handle. "To your arms, men!" roared Sir Nigel. "Shoot while you may, and then out sword, and let us live or die together." Chapter 36. Chapter 37 of the White Company. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. The White Company by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 37. How the White Company came to be disbanded. Then uprose from the hill in the rugged Cantabrian valley a sound such as had not been heard in those parts before, nor was again until the streams which rippled amid the rocks had been frozen by over 400 winters and thawed by as many returning springs. Deep and full and strong it thundered down the ravine, the fierce battle call of a warrior race, the last stern welcome to whoso should join with them in that world old game where the stake is death. Thrice it swelled forth, and thrice it sank away, echoing and reverberating amid the crags. Then with set faces the Company rose up among the storm of stones, and looked down upon the thousands who sped swiftly up the slope against them. Horse and spear had been set aside, but on foot, with sword and battle axe, their broad shields slung in front of them, the chivalry of Spain rushed to the attack. And now arose a struggle so fell, so long, so evenly sustained, that even now the memory of it is handed down amongst the Cantabrian mountaineers, and the ill omened knoll is still pointed out by fathers to their children as the Altura de los Inglesos, where the men from across the sea fought the great fight with the knights of the south. The last arrow was quickly shot, nor could the slingers hurl their stones, so close were friend and foe. From side to side stretched the thin line of the English, lightly armed and quick footed, whilst against it stormed and raged the pressing throng of fiery Spaniards and of gallant Bretons. The clink of crossing sword blades, the dull thudding of heavy blows, the panting and gasping of weary and wounded men, all rose together in a wild, long drawn note, which swelled upwards to the ears of the wondering peasants, who looked down from the edges of the cliffs upon the swaying turmoil of the battle beneath them. Back and forth reeled the leopard banner, now borne up the slope by the rush and weight of the onslaught, now pushing downwards again, as Sir Nigel, Burley, and Black Simon, with their veteran men at arms, flung themselves madly into the fray. Alleyne, at his lord's right hand, found himself swept hither and thither in the desperate struggle, exchanging savage thrusts one instant with a Spanish cavalier, and the next torn away by the whirl of men and dashed up against some new antagonist. To the right Sir Oliver, Aylward, Hordle John, and the bowmen of the Company fought furiously against the monkish knights of Santiago, who were led up the hill by their prior, a great deep chested man who wore a brown monastic habit over his suit of mail. 3 archers he slew in 3 giant strokes, but Sir Oliver flung his arms around him, and the two, staggering and straining, reeled backwards and fell, locked in each other's grasp over the edge of the steep cliff which flanked the hill. In vain his knights stormed and raved against the thin line which barred their path. The sword of Aylward and the great axe of John gleamed in the forefront of the battle, and huge jagged pieces of rock, hurled by the strong arms of the bowmen, crashed and hurtled amid their ranks. Slowly they gave back down the hill, the archers still hanging upon their skirts, with a long litter of writhing and twisted figures to mark the course which they had taken. At the same instant the Welshmen upon the left,
led on by the Scotch earl, had charged out from among the rocks which sheltered them, and by the fury of their outfall had driven the Spaniards in front of them in headlong flight down the hill. In the centre only things seemed to be going ill with the defenders. Black Simon was down, dying as he would have wished to have died, like a grim old wolf in its lair, with a ring of his slain around him. Twice Sir Nigel had been overborne, and twice Alleyne had fought over him until he had staggered to his feet once more. Burley lay senseless, stunned by a blow from a mace, and half of the men at arms lay littered upon the ground around him. Sir Nigel's shield was broken, his crest shorn, his armor cut and smashed, and the visor torn from his helmet. Yet he sprang hither and thither with light foot and ready hand, engaging two Bretons and a Spaniard at the same instant, thrusting, stooping, dashing in, springing out, while Alleyne still fought by his side, stemming with a handful of men the fierce tide which surged up against them. Yet it would have fared ill with them had not the archers from either side closed in upon the flanks of the attackers, and pressed them very slowly and foot by foot down the long slope, until they were on the plain once more, where their fellows were already rallying for a fresh assault. But terrible indeed was the cost at which the last man had been repelled. Of the 370 men who held the crest, 172 were left standing, many of whom were sorely wounded and weak from loss of blood. Sir Oliver Buttesthorn, Sir Richard Causton, Sir Simon Burley, Black Simon, Johnston, 150 archers and 47 men at arms had fallen, while the pitiless hail of stones was already whizzing and piping once more about their ears, threatening every instant to further reduce their numbers. Sir Nigel looked about him at his shattered ranks, and his face flushed with a soldier's pride. "By St. Paul!" he cried, "I have fought in many a little bickering, but never one that I would be more loath to have missed than this. But you are wounded, Alleyne." "It is naught," answered the squire, staunching the blood which dripped from a sword cut across his forehead. "These gentlemen of Spain seem to be most courteous and worthy people. I see that they are already forming to continue this debate with us. Form up the bowmen 2 deep instead of 4. By my faith, some very brave men have gone from amongst us. Aylward, you are a trusty soldier, for all that your shoulder has never felt accolade, nor your heels worn the golden spurs. Do you take charge of the right. I will hold the centre, and you, my Lord of Angus, the left." "Ho for Sir Samkin Aylward!" cried a rough voice among the archers, and a roar of laughter greeted their new leader. "By my hilt," said the old bowman, "I never thought to lead a wing in a stricken field. Stand close, camarade, for by these finger bones we must play the man this day." "Come hither, Alleyne," said Sir Nigel, walking back to the edge of the cliff which formed the rear of their position. "And you, Norbury," he continued, beckoning to the squire of Sir Oliver, "do you also come here." The 2 squires hurried across to him, and the 3 stood looking down into the rocky ravine which lay 150 feet beneath them. "The prince must hear of how things are with us," said the knight. "Another outfall we may withstand, but they are many and we are few, so that the time must come when we can no longer form a line across the hill. Yet, if help were brought us, we might hold the crest until it comes. See yonder horses which stray among the rocks beneath us?" "I see them, my fair lord." "And see yonder path which winds along the hill upon the further end of the valley?" "I see it." "Were you on those horses and riding up yonder track, steep and rough as it is, I think that you might gain the valley beyond, then on to the prince, and tell him how we fare." "But, my fair lord, how can we hope to reach the horses?" asked Norbury. "Ye cannot go round to them, for they would be upon ye ere ye could come down to them. Think ye that ye have heart enough to clamber down this cliff?" "Had we but a rope." "There is one here. It is but 100 feet long, and for the rest you must trust to God and to your fingers. Can you try it, Alleyne?" "With all my heart, my dear lord. But how can I leave you in such a strait?" "Nay, it is to serve me that you go. And you, Norbury?" The silent squire said nothing, but he took up the rope, and having examined it, he tied one end firmly around a projecting rock. Then he cast off his breastplate, thigh pieces, and greaves, while Alleyne followed his example. "Tell Chandos or Calverley or Knolles, should the prince have gone forward," cried Sir Nigel. "Now may God speed ye, for ye are brave and worthy men." It was, indeed, a task which might make the heart of the bravest sink within him. The thin cord dangling down the face of the brown cliff seemed from above to reach little more than half way down it. Beyond stretched the rugged rock, wet and shining, with a green tuft here and there thrusting out from it, but little sign of ridge or foothold. Far below, the jagged points of the boulders bristled up, dark and menacing. Norbury tugged thrice with all his strength upon the cord, and then lowered himself over the edge, while 100 anxious faces peered over at him as he slowly clambered downwards to the end of the rope. Twice he stretched out his foot, and twice he failed to reach the point at which he aimed. But even as he swung himself for a third effort, a stone from a sling buzzed like a wasp from amid the rocks and struck him full upon the side of his head. His grasp relaxed, his feet slipped, and in an instant he was a crushed and mangled corpse upon the sharp ridges beneath him. "If I have no better fortune," said Alleyne, leading Sir Nigel aside, "I pray you, my dear lord, that you will give my humble service to the Lady Maude, and say to her that I was ever her true servant and most unworthy cavalier." The old knight said no word, but he put a hand on either shoulder and kissed his squire, with the tears shining in his eyes. Alleyne sprang to the rope, and sliding swiftly down soon found himself at its extremity. From above it seemed as though rope and cliff were well nigh touching, but now, when swinging 100 feet down, the squire found that he could scarce reach the face of the rock with his foot, and that it was as smooth as glass, with no resting place where a mouse could stand. Some 3 feet lower, however, his eye lit upon a long jagged crack which slanted downwards, and this he must reach if he would save not only his own poor life, but that of the 80 men above him. Yet it were madness to spring for that narrow slit with naught but the wet, smooth rock to cling to. He swung for a moment, full of thought, and even as he hung there another of the hellish stones sang through his curls and struck a chip from the face of the cliff. Up he clambered a few feet, drew up the loose end after him, unslung his belt, held on with knee and with elbow while he spliced the long, tough leathern belt to the end of the cord. Then, lowering himself as far as he could go, he swung backwards and forwards until his hand reached the crack, when he left the rope and clung to the face of the cliff. Another stone struck him on the side, and he heard a sound like a breaking stick, with a keen stabbing pain which shot through his chest. Yet it was no time now to think of pain or ache. There was his lord and his 80 comrades, and they must be plucked from the jaws of death. On he clambered, with his hand shuffling down the long sloping crack, sometimes bearing all his weight upon his arms, at others finding some small shelf or tuft on which to rest his foot. Would he never pass over that 50 feet? He dared not look down, and could but grope slowly onwards, his face to the cliff, his fingers clutching, his feet scraping and feeling for a support. Every vein and crack and mottling of that face of rock remained forever stamped upon his memory. At last, however, his foot came upon a broad resting place, and he ventured to cast a glance downward. Thank God! He had reached the highest of those fatal pinnacles on which his comrade had fallen. Quickly now he sprang from rock to rock until his feet were on the ground, and he had his hand stretched out for the horse's rein, when a sling stone struck him upon the head, and he dropped senseless upon the ground. An evil blow it was for Alleyne, but a worse one still for him who struck it. The Spanish slinger, seeing the youth lie slain, and judging from his dress that he was no common man, rushed forward to plunder him, knowing well that the bowmen above him had expended their last shaft. He was still 3 paces, however, from his victim's side, when John upon the cliff above plucked up a huge boulder, and, poising it for an instant, dropped it with fatal aim upon the slinger beneath him. It struck upon his shoulder and hurled him, crushed and screaming, to the ground, while Alleyne, recalled to his senses by these shrill cries in his very ear, staggered on to his feet and gazed wildly about him. His eyes fell upon the horses grazing upon the scanty pasture, and in an instant all had come back to him: his mission, his comrades, the need for haste. He was dizzy, sick, faint, but he must not die, and he must not tarry, for his life meant many lives that day. In an instant he was in his saddle and spurring down the valley. Loud rang the swift charger's hoofs over rock and reef, while the fire flew from the stroke of iron, and the loose stones showered up behind him. But his head was whirling round, the blood was gushing from his brow, his temple, his mouth. Ever keener and sharper was the deadly pain which shot like a red hot arrow through his side. He felt that his eye was glazing, his senses slipping from him, his grasp upon the reins relaxing. Then, with one mighty effort, he called upon all his strength for a single minute. Stooping down, he loosened the stirrup straps, bound his knees tightly to the saddle flaps, twisted his hands in the bridle, and then, putting the gallant horse's head for the mountain path, he dashed the spurs in and fell forward, fainting with his face buried in the coarse black mane. Little could he ever remember of that wild ride. Half conscious, but ever with the one thought beating in his mind, he goaded the horse onwards, rushing swiftly down steep ravines, over huge boulders, along the edges of black abysses. Dim memories he had of beetling cliffs, of a group of huts with wondering faces at the doors, of foaming, clattering water, and of a bristle of mountain beeches. Once, ere he had ridden far, he heard behind him three deep, sullen shouts, which told him that his comrades had set their faces to the foe once more. Then all was blank, until he woke to find kindly blue English eyes peering down upon him, and to hear the blessed sound of his country's speech. They were but a foraging party, 100 archers and as many men at arms, but their leader was Sir Hugh Calverley, and he was not a man to bide idle when good blows were to be had not 3 leagues from him. A scout was sent flying with a message to the camp, and Sir Hugh, with his 200 men, thundered off to the rescue. With them went Alleyne, still bound to his saddle, still dripping with blood, and swooning and recovering, and swooning once again. On they rode and on, until at last, topping a ridge, they looked down upon the fateful valley. Alas and alas for the sight that met their eyes! There beneath them was the blood bathed hill, and from the highest pinnacle there flaunted the yellow and white banner, with the lions and the towers of the royal house of Castile. Up the long slope rushed ranks and ranks of men, exultant, shouting with waving pennons and brandished arms. Over the whole summit were dense throngs of knights, with no enemy that could be seen to face them, save only that at one corner of the plateau an eddy and swirl amid the crowded mass seemed to show that all resistance was not yet at an end. At the sight a deep groan of rage and of despair went up from the baffled rescuers, and spurring on their horses they clattered down the long and winding path which led to the valley beneath. But they were too late to avenge, as they had been too late to save. Long ere they could gain the level ground, the Spaniards, seeing them riding swiftly amid the rocks, and being ignorant of their numbers, drew off from the captured hill, and having secured their few prisoners, rode slowly in a long column, with drum beating and cymbal clashing, out of the valley. Their rear ranks were already passing out of sight ere the newcomers were urging their panting, foaming horses up the slope which had been the scene of that long drawn and bloody fight. And a fearsome sight it was that met their eyes. Across the lower end lay the dense heap of men and horses where the first arrow storm had burst. Above, the bodies of the dead and the dying, French, Spanish, and Aragonese, lay thick and thicker, until they covered the whole ground 2 and 3 deep in one dreadful tangle of slaughter. Above them lay the Englishmen in their lines, even as they had stood, and high yet upon the plateau a wild medley of the dead of all nations, where the last deadly grapple had left them. In the further corner, under the shadow of a great rock, there crouched 7 bowmen, with Great John in the centre of them, all wounded, weary, and in sorry case, but still unconquered, with their blood stained weapons waving and their voices ringing a welcome to their countrymen. Alleyne rode across to John, while Sir Hugh Calverley followed close behind him. "By St. George!" cried Sir Hugh, "I have never seen signs of so stern a fight, and I am right glad that we have been in time to save you."
"You have saved more than us," said John,
pointing to the banner which leaned against the rock behind him. "You have done nobly," cried the old free companion, gazing with a soldier's admiration at the huge frame and bold face of the archer. "But why is it, my good fellow, that you sit upon this man?"
"Oh, by the rood, I had forgot him,"
John answered, rising and dragging from under him no less a person than the Spanish caballero, Don Diego Alvarez.
"This man, my fair lord, means to me a new house, 10 cows, 1 bull, if it be but a little one, a grindstone, and I know what besides, so that I thought it well to sit upon him, lest he should take a fancy to leave me."
"Tell me, John," cried Alleyne faintly, "where is my dear lord, Sir Nigel Loring?"
"He is dead, I fear. I saw them throw his body across a horse and ride away with it, but I fear the life had gone from him."
"Now, woe worth me! And where is Aylward?"
"He sprang upon a riderless horse and rode after Sir Nigel to save him. I saw them throng about him, and he is either taken or slain."
"Blow the bugles!" cried Sir Hugh, with a scowling brow. "We must back to camp, and ere 3 days I trust that we may see these Spaniards again. I would fain have you all in my company."
"We are of the White Company, my fair lord," said John.
"Nay, the White Company is here disbanded," answered Sir Hugh solemnly, looking around him at the lines of silent figures. "Look to the brave squire, for I fear that he will never see the sun rise again." Chapter 37. Of the White Company. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. The White Company by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 38. Of the Homecoming to Hampshire. It was a bright July morning, 4 months after that fatal fight in the Spanish barranca. A blue heaven stretched above, a green rolling plain undulated below, intersected with hedgerows and flecked with grazing sheep. The sun was yet low in the heaven, and the red cows stood in the long shadow of the elms, chewing the cud and gazing with great vacant eyes at 2 horsemen who were spurring it down the long white road which dipped and curved away back to where the towers and pinnacles beneath the flat topped hill marked the old town of Winchester. Of the riders one was young, graceful, and fair, clad in plain doublet and hosen of blue Brussels cloth, which served to show his active and well knit figure. A flat velvet cap was drawn forward to keep the glare from his eyes, and he rode with lips compressed and anxious face, as one who has much care upon his mind. Young as he was, and peaceful as was his dress, the dainty golden spurs which twinkled upon his heels proclaimed his knighthood, while a long seam upon his brow and a scar at his temple gave a manly grace to his refined and delicate countenance. His comrade was a large red headed man upon a great black horse, with a huge canvas bag slung from his saddle bow, which jingled and clinked at every movement of his steed. His broad brown face was lighted up by a continual smile, and he looked slowly from side to side with eyes which twinkled and shone with delight. Well might John rejoice, for was he not back in his native Hampshire? Had he not Don Diego's 5,000 crowns rasping against his knee? And, above all, was he not himself now squire to Sir Alleyn Edricson, the young Socman of Minstead, lately knighted by the sword of the Black Prince himself, and esteemed by the whole army as one of the most rising of the soldiers of England? For the last stand of the Company had been told throughout Christendom wherever a brave deed of arms was loved, and honours had flowed in upon the few who had survived it. For 2 months Alleyne had wavered betwixt death and life, with a broken rib and a shattered head, yet youth and strength and a cleanly life were all upon his side, and he woke from his long delirium to find that the war was over, that the Spaniards and their allies had been crushed at Navarre, and that the prince had himself heard the tale of his ride for succour, and had come in person to his bedside to touch his shoulder with his sword, and to ensure that so brave and true a man should die, if he could not live, within the order of chivalry. The instant that he could set foot to ground, Alleyne had started in search of his lord. But no word could he hear of him, dead or alive, and he had come home now sad hearted, in the hope of raising money upon his estates, and so starting upon his quest once more. Landing at London, he had hurried on with a mind full of care, for he had heard no word from Hampshire since the short note which had announced his brother's death.
"By the rood!" cried John, looking around him exultantly, "where have we seen since we left such noble cows, such fleecy sheep, grass so green, or a man so drunk as yonder rogue who lies in the gap of the hedge?"
"Ah, John," Alleyne answered wearily, "it is well for you, but I never thought that my home coming would be so sad a one. My heart is heavy for my dear lord and for Aylward, and I know not how I may break the news to the Lady Mary and to the Lady Maude, if they have not yet had tidings of it." John gave a groan which made the horses shy.
"It is indeed a black business," said he. "But be not sad, for I shall give half these crowns to my mother, and half will I add to the money which you may have, and so we shall buy that yellow cog wherein we sailed to Bordeaux, and in it we shall go forth and seek Sir Nigel."
Alleyne smiled, but shook his head. "Were he alive we should have had word of him ere now," said he. "But what is this town before us?"
"Why, it is Romsey," cried John. "See the tower of the old grey church and the long stretch of the nunnery. But here sits a very holy man, and I shall give him a crown for his prayers."
3 large stones formed a rough cot by the roadside, and beside it, basking in the sun, sat the hermit, with clay colored face, dull eyes, and long withered hands. With crossed ankles and sunken head he sat as though all his life had passed out of him, with the beads slipping slowly through his thin yellow fingers. Behind him lay the narrow cell, clay floored and damp, comfortless, profitless, and sordid. Beyond it there lay amid the trees the wattle and daub hut of a laborer, the door open, and the single room exposed to the view. The man, ruddy and yellow haired, stood leaning upon the spade wherewith he had been at work upon the garden patch. From behind him came the ripple of a happy woman's laughter, and 2 young urchins darted forth from the hut, bare legged and towsy, while the mother, stepping out, laid her hand upon her husband's arm and watched the gambols of the children. The hermit frowned at the untoward noise which broke upon his prayers, but his brow relaxed as he looked upon the broad silver piece which John held out to him. "There lies the image of our past and of our future," cried Alleyne, as they rode on upon their way. "Now, which is better, to till God's earth, to have happy faces round one's knee, and to love and be loved, or to sit forever moaning over one's own soul, like a mother over a sick babe?"
"I know not about that," said John, "for it casts a great cloud over me when I think of such matters. But I know that my crown was well spent, for the man had the look of a very holy person. As to the other, there was naught holy about him that I could see, and it would be cheaper for me to pray for myself than to give a crown to one who spent his days in digging for lettuces."
Ere Alleyne could answer, there swung round the curve of the road a lady's carriage drawn by 3 horses abreast, with a postilion upon the outer one. Very fine and rich it was, with beams painted and gilt, wheels and spokes carved in strange figures, and over all an arched cover of red and white tapestry. Beneath its shade there sat a stout and elderly lady in a pink cote hardie, leaning back among a pile of cushions, and plucking out her eyebrows with a small pair of silver tweezers. None could seem more safe and secure and at her ease than this lady. Yet here also was a symbol of human life, for in an instant, even as Alleyne reined aside to let the carriage pass, a wheel flew out from among its fellows, and over it all toppled, carving, tapestry, and gilt, in one wild heap, with the horses plunging, the postilion shouting, and the lady screaming from within. In an instant Alleyne and John were on foot, and had lifted her forth, all in a shake with fear, but little the worse for her mischance. "No, woe worth me!" she cried, "and ill fallen Michael Easover of Romsey, for I told him that the pin was loose, and yet he must needs gainsay me, like the foolish daft that he is." "I trust that you have taken no hurt, my fair lady," said Alleyne, conducting her to the bank, upon which John had already placed a cushion. "Nay, I have no scathe, though I have lost my silver tweezers. Now, lack a day, did God ever put breath into such a fool as Michael Easover of Romsey! But I am much beholden to you, gentle sirs. Soldiers ye are, as one may readily see. I am myself a soldier's daughter," she added, casting a somewhat languishing glance at John, "and my heart ever goes out to a brave man." "We are indeed fresh from Spain," quoth Alleyne. "From Spain, say you? Ah, it was an ill and sorry thing that so many should throw away the lives that Heaven gave them. In sooth, it is bad for those who fall, but worse for those who bide behind. I have but now bid farewell to one who hath lost all in this cruel war." "And how that, lady?" "She is a young damsel of these parts, and she goes now into a nunnery. Alack, it is not a year since she was the fairest maid from Avon to Itchen, and now it was more than I could abide to wait at Romsey nunnery to see her put the white veil upon her face, for she was made for a wife and not for the cloister. Did you ever, gentle sir, hear of a body of men called the White Company over yonder?" "Surely so," cried both the comrades. "Her father was the leader of it, and her lover served under him as squire. News hath come that not one of the company was left alive, and so, poor lamb, she hath—" "Lady," cried Alleyne, catching his breath, "is it the Lady Maude Loring of whom you speak?" "It is, in sooth." "Maude, and in a nunnery! Did, then, the thought of her father's death so move her?" "Her father!" cried the lady, smiling. "Nay, Maude is a good daughter, but I think it was this young golden haired squire, of whom I have heard, who has made her turn her back upon the world." "And I stand talking here!" cried Alleyne wildly. "Come, John, come!" Rushing to his horse, he swung himself into the saddle, and was off down the road in a rolling cloud of dust as fast as his good steed could bear him. Great had been the rejoicing amid the Romsey nuns when the Lady Maude Loring had craved admission into their order. For was she not sole child and heiress of the old knight, with farms and fiefs which she could bring to the great nunnery? Long and earnest had been the talks of the gaunt lady abbess, in which she had conjured the young novice to turn forever from the world, and to rest her bruised heart under the broad and peaceful shelter of the church. And now, when all was settled, and when abbess and lady superior had had their will, it was but fitting that some pomp and show should mark the glad occasion. Hence it was that the good burghers of Romsey were all in the streets, that gay flags and flowers brightened the path from the nunnery to the church, and that a long procession wound up to the old arched door leading up the bride to these spiritual nuptials. There was lay Sister Agatha with the high gold crucifix, and the 3 incense bearers, and the 22 garbed in white, who cast flowers upon either side of them and sang sweetly the while. Then with 4 attendants came the novice, her drooping head wreathed with white blossoms, and behind, the abbess and her council of older nuns, who were already counting in their minds whether their own bailiff could manage the farms of Twynham, or whether a reeve would be needed beneath him to draw the utmost from these new possessions which this young novice was about to bring them. But alas for plots and plans, when love and youth and nature, and, above all, fortune, are arrayed against them. Who is this travel stained youth who dares to ride so madly through the lines of staring burghers? Why does he fling himself from his horse and stare so strangely about him? See how he has rushed through the incense bearers, thrust aside lay Sister Agatha, scattered the 22 damsels who sang so sweetly, and he stands before the novice with his hands outstretched, and his face shining, and the light of love in his grey eyes. Her foot is on the very lintel of the church, and yet he bars the way, and she thinks no more of the wise words and holy rede of the lady abbess, but she hath given a sobbing cry, and hath fallen forward with his arms around her drooping body, and her wet cheek upon his breast. A sorry sight this for the gaunt abbess, and ill lesson for the stainless 22, who have ever been taught that the way of nature is the way of sin. but Maude and Alleyne care little for this. A dank, cold air comes from the black arch before them. Without, the sun shines bright and the birds are singing amid the ivy on the drooping beeches. Their choice is made, and they turn away hand in hand, with their backs to the darkness and their faces to the light. Very quiet was the wedding in the old priory church at Christchurch, where Father Christopher read the service, and there were few to see save the Lady Loring and John and a dozen bowmen from the castle. The Lady of Twynham had drooped and pined for weary months, so that her face was harsher and less comely than before. Yet she still hoped on, for her lord had come through so many dangers that she could scarce believe that he might be stricken down at last. It had been her wish to start for Spain and to search for him, but Alleyne had persuaded her to let him go in her place. There was much to look after now that the lands of Minstead were joined to those of Twynham, and Alleyne had promised her that if she would but bide with his wife, he would never come back to Hampshire again until he had gained some news, good or ill, of her lord and lover. The yellow cog had been engaged, with Goodwin Hawtayne in command, and a month after the wedding Alleyne rode down to Buckler's Hard to see if she had come round yet from Southampton. On the way he passed the fishing village of Pitt's Deep, and marked that a little creyer or brig was tacking off the land, as though about to anchor there. On his way back, as he rode towards the village, he saw that she was indeed anchored, and that many boats were around her, bearing cargo to the shore. A bow shot from Pitt's Deep there was an inn a little back from the road, very large and widespread, with a great green bush hung upon a pole from one of the upper windows. At this window he marked, as he rode up, that a man was seated who appeared to be craning his neck in his direction. Alleyne was still looking up at him when a woman came rushing from the open door of the inn, and made as though she would climb a tree, looking back the while with a laughing face. Wondering what these doings might mean, Alleyne tied his horse to a tree, and was walking amid the trunks towards the inn, when there shot from the entrance a second woman, who also made for the trees. Close at her heels came a burly, brown faced man, who leaned against the door post and laughed loudly with his hand to his side. "Ah, mes belles," he cried, "and is it thus you treat me? Ah, mes petites, I swear by these finger bones that I would not hurt a hair of your pretty heads. But I have been among the black paynim, and by my hilt, it does me good to look at your English cheeks. Come, drink a stoup of muscadine with me, mes anges, for my heart is warm to be among ye again." At the sight of the man Alleyne stood staring, but at the sound of his voice such a thrill of joy bubbled up in his heart that he had to bite his lip to keep himself from shouting outright. But a deeper pleasure yet was in store. Even as he looked, the window above was pushed outwards, and the voice of the man whom he had seen there came out from it. "Aylward," cried the voice, "I have seen just now a very worthy person come down the road, though my eyes could scarce discern whether he carried coat armor. I pray you to wait upon him, and tell him that a very humble knight of England abides here, so that if he be in need of advancement, or have any small vow upon his soul, or desire to exalt his lady, I may help him to accomplish it." Aylward at this order came shuffling forward amid the trees, and in an instant the two men were clinging in each other's arms, laughing and shouting and patting each other in their delight, while old Sir Nigel came running with his sword, under the impression that some small bickering had broken out, only to embrace and be embraced himself, until all three were hoarse with their questions and outcries and congratulations. On their journey home through the woods, Alleyne learnt their wondrous story. How, when Sir Nigel came to his senses, he with his fellow captive had been hurried to the coast and conveyed by sea to their captor's castle. How, upon the way, they had been taken by a Barbary rover, and how they exchanged their light captivity for a seat on a galley bench and hard labour at the pirates' oars. How, in the port at Barbary, Sir Nigel had slain the Moorish captain, and had swum with Aylward to a small coaster which they had taken, and so made their way to England with a rich cargo to reward them for their toils. All this Alleyne listened to, until the dark keep of Twynham towered above them in the gloaming, and they saw the red sun lying athwart the rippling Avon. No need to speak of the glad hearts at Twynham Castle that night, nor the rich offerings from out that Moorish cargo which found their way to the chapel of Father Christopher. Sir Nigel Loring lived for many years, full of honor and laden with every blessing. He rode no more to the wars, but he found his way to every jousting within 30 miles, and the Hampshire youth treasured it as their highest honor when a word of praise fell from him as to their management of their horses or their breaking of their lances. So he lived and so he died, the most revered and the happiest man in all his native shire. For Sir Alleyn Edricson and for his beautiful bride the future had also naught but what was good. Twice he fought in France, and came back each time laden with honors. A high place at court was given to him, and he spent many years at Windsor under the second Richard and the fourth Henry, where he received the honor of the Garter, and won the name of being a brave soldier, a true hearted gentleman, and a great lover and patron of every art and science which refines or ennobles life. As to John, he took unto himself a village maid and settled in Lyndhurst, where his 5,000 crowns made him the richest franklin for many miles around. For many years he drank his ale every night at the Pied Merlin, which was now kept by his friend Aylward, who had wedded the good widow to whom he had committed his blunder. The strong men and the bowmen of the country round used to drop in there of an evening to wrestle a fall with John or to shoot a round with Aylward, but though a silver shilling was to be the prize of the victory, it has never been reported that any man earned much money in that fashion. So they lived, these men, in their own lusty, cheery fashion, rude and rough, but honest, kindly, and true. Let us thank God if we have outgrown their vices, and let us pray to God that we may ever hold their virtues. The sky may darken, and the clouds may gather, and again the day may come when Britain may have sore need of her children on whatever shore of the sea they be found. Shall they not muster at her call? End of chapter 38. End of the White Company by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.